The archivist had spent most of his life in silence, surrounded by the dust of forgotten tomes and the yellowed edges of books no one cared to touch. To his colleagues, he was invisible, a shadow that drifted from shelf to shelf, cataloging what others dismissed as junk from the past. Yet in that stillness, he had grown accustomed to secrets, the kinds of whispers that lived in brittle bindings and half-erased ink. It was on a quiet winter morning that his fate changed. The library's roof had leaked the night before, and he was sent to inspect a damp corner no scholar had touched in decades. He pulled out a bundle of moldy manuscripts, and as he shook the dust from their cracked covers, a thin piece of parchment slid from the hollow spine of a book. Torn, fragile, and almost weightless, it fell into his hands like a ghost, slipping free from centuries of neglect. At first glance, it looked like nothing, just fragments of Greek writing scrawled across faded vellum. But as the archivist leaned closer, his breath caught. There was a phrase barely legible, referencing Aegyptos, the ancient Greek word for Egypt, and next to it, a symbol, the unmistakable sunburst of Macedon, the emblem tied to Alexander the Great. His heart thumped with a violence he had never felt before. For a moment, he dared not believe it. This could not be real. Thousands of historians had searched for Alexander's tomb, argued about it, and written endless volumes on its location. Cities had been excavated, deserts combed, legends debated, yet no one had found it. How could it be possible that such a clue would fall into the hands of a man like him, a man no one even remembered at staff meetings? The archivist pressed the parchment flat against the table, running trembling fingers across its torn edges. His mind began to race. If this was genuine, then perhaps the greatest mystery of antiquity had just spoken through the silence of an old library. But then came the voice of doubt, echoing in his head, sharp and cruel. You? What could you possibly do with this? No one will listen to you. You're just a caretaker of dust. The archivist closed his eyes. He had heard these words before, not from parchment, but from people. His father, a failed historian, had called him a disappointment. His professors, during his brief years at university, dismissed his questions as trivial. Even now, the senior scholars who frequented the library barely remembered his name. He had grown used to being overlooked, but as he looked again at the parchment, he realized something had shifted. The world might not know his name, but the parchment had found him. The ink stains seemed to breathe under the dim lamplight, as though urging him not to hide this time. He imagined Alexander himself, triumphant and relentless, commanding armies across the world. The thought pierced him. If the parchment really led to Alexander's resting place, then history had chosen the most unlikely of messengers. He stayed long after the library closed, his lamp burning into the small hours. He studied every line, tracing each stroke with near reverence. The Greek text, though fragmented, mentioned a procession south, a burial not in Babylon as some accounts suggested, but elsewhere, where the sun meets the river and the sands swallow the stars. The words struck him like a riddle waiting to be solved. Egypt, the Nile, the desert. For the first time in his life, the archivist felt alive with purpose. He imagined himself stepping out of obscurity, guided not by recognition or glory, but by the truth hidden in this fragile relic. He would not let this be discarded as another piece of moldy parchment. He would follow it, no matter the cost. Yet in his chest, fear lingered. What if he was wrong? What if he misread the script, and all that awaited him was ridicule? He could already hear the mocking laughter of professors, the sighs of exasperation, the patronizing smiles of academics who wore their arrogance like crowns. Still, as the night deepened, the archivist clenched the parchment tight, a vow hardening inside him. He would not surrender this discovery to those who had ignored him his whole life. And so the first step had been taken not by an emperor, not by a celebrated historian, but by a man whose footsteps had always been quiet. The torn parchment, overlooked by time itself, had found its keeper. And in that fragile moment, the archivist felt destiny stir in the dust. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of history's proudest scholars. The archivist tucked the parchment into his coat pocket, his heart pounding. Beyond the stone walls of the library, the world carried on, unaware that the secret of Alexander's tomb had just awoken in the hands of a man no one ever noticed. Tomorrow, the world would test him. The morning after his discovery, the archivist's heart carried a quiet fire, though he tried to mask it beneath his usual calm exterior. He had learned long ago that excitement in his world was dangerous. It exposed him, invited ridicule. Still, as he walked through the library's grand hall, with the parchment folded neatly in his satchel, his pulse hammered with an energy he hadn't felt in years. He told himself he needed allies. Someone had to see what he had found, someone with knowledge and influence. And so, with a hesitation that bordered on trembling, he approached the senior historians who gathered daily in the reading room. They were giants in his eyes, men and women whose names adorned university presses, who filled lecture halls with their booming voices. To them, he was little more than background furniture, the man who replaced broken lamps and fetched catalogs. "Excuse me," he began softly, holding the parchment with both hands. I found something last night. A fragment. It may reference Alexander's burial." The room turned toward him, curious at first. One of the professors, Dr. Martel, with his commanding beard and voice, arched a brow. "Alexander, my dear boy, half the world has claimed that discovery. What makes yours different?" The archivist laid the parchment on the table. For a moment, a hush fell. The Greek words, faint but legible, glimmered under the lamplight. The scholars leaned in, murmuring among themselves. But then came the laughter, low at first, then swelling. "Surely you don't expect us to take this seriously," another professor scoffed. "A janitor of manuscripts deciphering clues lost to centuries of historians? He probably misread it," said another, waving a dismissive hand. "These fragments are riddled with errors, copies of copies. There's nothing here but the dreams of amateurs." The archivist's cheeks burned, though he kept his eyes fixed on the parchment. He wanted to protest, to insist that the symbol of Macedon was clear, that the riddle-like phrase matched descriptions of Alexander's funeral procession. But as he opened his mouth, Dr. Martel chuckled and shook his head. "You're letting your imagination run wild," Martel said with paternal condescension. "Leave the deciphering to us. Your role is to preserve, not interpret." The archivist's hands trembled as he reclaimed the parchment. Their voices rang in his ears, mockery dressed in intellect, disdain sharpened into weapons. He could feel the weight of every failure in his life pressing down again. The professors who told him he wasn't clever enough. The father who had sighed when he abandoned university. The countless days of invisibility in these very halls. Yet beneath the humiliation, a stubborn ember refused to go out. He remembered the words on the parchment, "Where the sun meets the river, and the sands swallow the stars." They burned brighter than their ridicule. If anything, their scorn only confirmed what he already suspected. They would never help him. This path was his alone. That night, alone once more in his cramped apartment, he unfolded the parchment again. The professor's laughter still echoed, but he drowned it out with determination. He traced the sunburst symbol with a fingertip, whispering the words under his breath as though reciting an oath. "If no one believes me, then I will go myself." In that moment, the archivist saw his life stretched behind him, decades of silence, service, and invisibility. And ahead, he saw a chance, however faint, to step into the light. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for truth. The parchment seemed almost alive in the dim glow of his lamp, a fragile compass pointing him toward destiny. The scholars might laugh, but they had not seen what he had seen. They did not feel what he felt. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would begin preparations. Maps, travel, savings. He would piece together the journey, just as he had pieced together the meaning of the parchment. And perhaps, when the sands of Egypt swallowed his footsteps, the same scholars who mocked him would be forced to listen. The archivist's nights blurred into one long vigil of ink, maps, and whispers from the parchment. He hardly ate, barely slept, and when he did, he dreamed of sand and fire, of a sun that bled across the horizon, while an unseen voice whispered riddles in ancient Greek. Each morning, he awoke with the taste of dust on his tongue, certain that the parchment was guiding him. He spread atlases across his table, each page layered with his scribbled notes. He traced the Nile's serpentine body, marking temples, lost cities, half-buried ruins. The phrase haunted him, where the sun meets the river and the sands swallow the stars. The words seemed too deliberate to be poetic fancy. They had the ring of a directive, a map disguised as prophecy. One night, hunched over his desk, he noticed something he had missed before. In the margin of the parchment, half obscured by age, there was a faint scratch, like a hastily drawn line pointing south of Memphis. His pulse quickened. South of Memphis, there lay the desert near Siwa, the very oasis where Alexander had visited the oracle of Amun, seeking to prove his divine lineage. Could it be? Could his final resting place have been hidden in the very land that confirmed his godhood? The archivist pressed his hands to his temples, thoughts racing. If the clue pointed to Siwa, then this was no accident. The ancients had wanted his burial to be both a secret and a statement, a return to the desert shrine where he had once been crowned son of a god. But with the revelation came dread. To reach Siwa was no simple pilgrimage. It was remote, harsh, a place where the desert stretched like an ocean, swallowing the unprepared. Travelers still died there, even with modern tools. And he had no experience of deserts, no knowledge of survival beyond the dim aisles of a library. His chest tightened. The laughter of the professors returned, echoing in his mind. Leave the deciphering to us. Your role is to preserve, not interpret. They would never believe him. If he failed, he would die forgotten, his body lost beneath the sand, his discovery ridiculed and erased. And yet if he succeeded, he leaned back, closing his eyes, forcing himself into silence. He remembered his father again, the failed historian who had wasted his life chasing shadows. A man who dreams of history, his father had once said bitterly, ends up buried by it. The archivist clenched his fists. He would prove that wrong. He would not be buried by history. He would unearth it. As dawn broke, he rose from his desk with a calm that startled even him. He counted his meager savings, sold his few valuables, and purchased a plane ticket to Cairo. The parchment he wrapped in oilskin and tucked against his chest, as though it were a heartbeat he could not lose. The world outside the library had always felt distant, like a place for others to live in. But now, stepping onto the crowded streets with his satchel heavy against his shoulder, he felt as though the universe had finally opened a path for him. Every honking car, every cry from the market stalls, every glance from strangers seemed to whisper the same thing: go south, find him. That night, as he prepared to leave, he stood by his window and stared at the stars. They glittered faintly above the city haze, fragile and unreachable. And he thought of the phrase once more, where the sands swallow the stars. Perhaps, he mused, it did not only mean geography. Perhaps it meant that to find Alexander, he must first lose himself. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. He touched the parchment one last time before closing his satchel. Tomorrow the desert would begin. Tomorrow the quiet archivist would take the first step into a story the world had long forgotten. The desert greeted him not with welcome, but with indifference. From the moment the archivist stepped off the weathered bus that dropped him near Siwa, the heat pressed against him like an invisible hand, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The air shimmered above the sand, the horizon blurring into a merciless expanse of gold and white. He carried little: a canvas bag with water, dried food, and the oilskin-wrapped parchment. His shoes, chosen in ignorance, filled quickly with grains of sand that bit into his feet with every step. Yet he pressed forward, clutching the parchment as if it were a compass forged by destiny itself. At first, he followed the rough tracks left by travelers and camels, comforted by the sense that civilization was still somewhere behind him. But within hours, the path vanished. The dunes rose higher, their shifting shapes mocking his sense of direction. Every step became a battle between willpower and exhaustion. The sun was unrelenting. It seared his skin, burned his lips dry, and filled his ears with silence so profound that he swore he could hear the thud of his own heart. He tried to steady himself with thoughts of the parchment, whispering the words he had memorized, where the sun meets the river and the sands swallow the stars. But here, there was no river, only the infinite crush of dunes. As night fell, the desert transformed. The heat bled away, replaced by a bitter chill. Above him, the sky exploded with stars, brighter and sharper than he had ever seen through the haze of cities. For a moment, he felt awe, as though he had stepped into the very vault of heaven. Yet soon, dread gnawed at him. The words of the parchment echoed again. The sands swallow the stars. And as he watched the dunes shifting under the wind, he thought of how easily the desert could swallow him too, erasing his existence as if he had never been. Sleep came in fragments, broken by fear. His dreams returned with greater force, visions of Alexander on a golden chariot, eyes burning like suns, leading armies across shifting sands. In the dream, the conqueror would turn to him, his voice both thunderous and intimate. "Do you dare to follow where I rest?" The archivist would reach out and awaken shivering, the desert silence his only reply. By the third day, his water ran low. The food he rationed with discipline, though hunger clawed at his belly. His lips cracked and bled, his legs trembled beneath him. Each dune he climbed revealed only more dunes, endless, indifferent, mocking. Doubt returned with cruel intensity. What if the professors were right? What if I've misread everything? What if I die here, alone, chasing shadows? He fell to his knees, clutching the parchment as if it could give him strength. The edges had grown softer with sweat, the ink smudged by his trembling fingers. He whispered aloud to himself, voice hoarse and broken, "No one believed me. No one ever will, unless I finish this." The desert wind howled in response, carrying grains of sand that stung his skin like needles. It seemed the earth itself was testing him, asking whether his resolve was stronger than despair. And then, as the sun bled into the horizon on the fourth evening, something happened. His foot pressed into the side of a dune, and the ground gave way beneath him. He tumbled down with a cry, sand swallowing him in a choking cloud. He struggled, coughing, his arms flailing until his hand struck something solid. Stone, cold, unyielding, and buried deep beneath centuries of sand. The archivist froze. His breath came in ragged gasps as he brushed away the grains. His fingertips traced carved lines, worn but deliberate. A pattern, an entrance. The desert silence pressed close around him. His doubts, his pain, his humiliation all faded in that instant. He had found something. Not a mirage, not a dream, a passage. With shaking hands, he clawed away at the sand, revealing a slab of stone sealed tight by time. The air seemed to thicken, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And in that moment, the archivist realized. He was no longer chasing shadows. He was standing on the threshold of history. The archivist's fingers bled as he scraped sand from the stone, yet he worked with a desperation that dulled the sting of his wounds. The slab resisted him like a guardian unwilling to yield its secret. Hours passed in a blur of clawing, pushing, and collapsing, until his arms trembled from exhaustion. But then, at last, his persistence was rewarded. A faint crack split along the slab's edge, releasing a whisper of stale air, so dry and heavy that it carried the scent of centuries. He froze, his chest tight. This was no ordinary stone. This was a doorway. Gathering his strength, he pressed against the weakened crack. The sand shifted again, pouring downward, and suddenly the slab tilted inward with a groaning protest. The archivist stumbled as a section of the dune collapsed, and in its place yawned a dark passage descending into the earth. His lamp flickered as he held it over the entrance. The air that rose was ancient, still, tasting of limestone and time. He hesitated, fear coiling in his stomach. Every instinct screamed to turn back, to flee the suffocating void below. Yet his trembling hands tightened on the parchment. This was what he had come for. This was what the laughter of scholars could not take from him. He lowered himself into the opening. The passage was narrow, forcing him to crouch as he descended. Sand crunched underfoot, the walls damp and cool in contrast to the merciless desert above. He felt the weight of the earth pressing down, each step sinking him deeper into silence. His lamp's glow licked against walls carved with faint reliefs, shapes half erased by time, yet unmistakable. Warriors, suns, chariots, Alexander's emblems. The archivist's throat tightened. His knees threatened to give way, but he pressed on, whispering to steady himself. It's real. It's real. The corridor wound downward until it opened into a stone chamber. The archivist stepped inside and nearly wept. Before him stretched a vast hall, its ceiling lost in shadow, its columns carved with motifs of conquest, spears, lions, the sunburst of Macedon. The silence was immense, as if the chamber had been waiting, holding its breath across millennia for this moment. His lamp flickered wildly, shadows dancing across the carvings. He moved slowly, reverently, feeling as though his very breath could shatter the sanctity of the place. And then he noticed the floor. Unlike the walls, which bore symbols of triumph, the stones beneath his feet were etched with words. Greek inscriptions, faint but legible, fragments of oaths, verses of mourning, and names of companions who had followed Alexander to the ends of the earth. The archivist fell to his knees, his trembling hand tracing a line of text. He who is called son of Zeus rests where gods and sands embrace. His vision blurred with tears. This was no dream. He was standing in a place history had denied existed. But awe quickly tangled with fear. If he was right, then he was the first soul to enter this hall in over 2,000 years. No scholar, no explorer, no empire had found it. And he was alone, deep beneath the desert, without anyone to witness or confirm. The weight of the discovery pressed on him like a crown of fire. It was too much for one man, too enormous for a single pair of hands. He thought of Martel and the other professors, their sneers and mockery. He thought of his father's scorn. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, echoing eerily against the chamber walls. Would they believe me now? The lamp flickered again, threatening to die. Panic rushed through him, but with it came clarity. He needed to go deeper, to see the truth with his own eyes, before the desert swallowed him whole. This was not the end of his journey. It was only the threshold. He rose, clutching the parchment against his chest, and advanced toward the far wall where the shadows seemed to pool. There, barely visible in the dim glow, was another passage, sealed but not impenetrable. He reached out, pressing his palm to the cold stone, feeling the vibrations of silence echo through his bone. And then, faintly, he thought he heard it, a sound so subtle it could have been imagination. The whisper of voices, not alive, not present, but carried from the past, murmuring through stone. He closed his eyes, heart pounding. They were waiting for him. He would not turn back. Not now. Not ever. The archivist pressed forward, each step carrying him deeper into the unknown. The narrow passage beyond the great hall tightened, forcing him to duck beneath jagged stone. His lamp quivered in his hand, its flames struggling in the thick, heavy air. The silence was crushing, broken only by the echo of his own breath. It was as though the world above had ceased to exist, and all that remained was this underworld of stone and memory. At last, the passage widened, opening into a vast chamber. His lamp illuminated walls, carved with scenes of conquest, Alexander astride Bucephalus, his armies stretching across the horizon, gods crowning him with laurels. The archivist staggered, overcome by the artistry, by the audacity of what he was witnessing. But then he noticed the stillness. The chamber was so quiet that even his heartbeat sounded intrusive. The air was stagnant, carrying with it the weight of centuries. It felt less like a room, and more like a tomb of silence itself. In the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, shrouded by a canopy of carved stone. He approached with reverence, his lamp casting long shadows that twisted across the floor. The columns supporting the canopy were etched with symbols he recognized from his studies: the star of Vergina, the double-headed axe, the serpent, symbols of power, eternity, and divine lineage. His throat tightened. Could it be? Could this truly be the final resting place of the man the world had chased for centuries? He stepped closer, and the chamber seemed to resist him. The silence deepened, thickening until his ears rang with pressure. His chest constricted, his breath came shallow. For a terrible moment, he wondered if he was trespassing into something forbidden, something meant never to be seen again. The archivist lowered his head, whispering, as though to appease the unseen guardians, "I come not for riches, not for glory, only truth." His words trembled in the chamber, as if testing the air. The silence absorbed them without reply. He climbed the steps of the platform. At its heart was a stone sarcophagus, plain yet commanding, its lid carved with faint reliefs of a lion and a sunburst. The archivist's hand hovered over it, inches from history itself. In that instant, memories surged: his father's scornful voice, Martel's laughter, years of invisibility in the library. All the humiliation, all the neglect, coiled into a single truth: he had found what they could not. Yet doubt gnawed at him. What if the sarcophagus was empty? What if it held only dust, or worse, a forgery left by some ancient deceiver? Would the world ever believe him without proof? His hand trembled as he pressed against the lid. It did not budge. He tried again, pushing with all his weight. The stone refused him, immovable, as though mocking his insignificance. Sweat trickled down his face, his arms burning with effort. Finally, he collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. Tears pricked his eyes, not of failure, but of desperation. He placed both palms on the sarcophagus, bowed his head, and whispered through clenched teeth, "If you are here, let me see you." The chamber seemed to exhale. A faint draft brushed his cheek, chilling him. His lamp flickered violently, nearly extinguishing. The archivist looked up, startled, and saw along the sarcophagus's edge a seam of light. No, not light, but the faint shimmer of air escaping through a hairline crack. His heart pounded. It was not sealed completely. Summoning the last of his strength, he wedged his fingers into the crack and heaved. His muscles screamed, his body shuddered, but slowly, agonizingly, the lid shifted. A grinding roar filled the chamber, stone against stone, like thunder trapped underground. And then, silence returned. The archivist leaned over, lamp trembling in his hand. His eyes widened, breath caught in his throat. Beneath the lid, within the sarcophagus, shadows stirred. The air smelled of resin, of embalming oils long forgotten, and though the chamber was silent, he swore he heard something, a faint echo, as though Alexander's spirit itself had just awoken. The archivist staggered back, clutching his chest, the enormity of it overwhelming him. He had crossed the threshold. He was standing at the edge of a revelation that could shake the world. The archivist's hands trembled as he steadied the lamp above the sarcophagus. The flame's glow revealed what his mind could scarcely process: a body, astonishingly preserved, swathed in linen darkened by resin. The face, though drawn by time, bore features unmistakable: sharp nose, regal brow, the faint shadow of curls pressed against the cloth. For a breathless moment, the archivist felt as if Alexander himself was lying before him, not as a legend in dusty chronicles, but as a man who had walked the earth. His chest constricted. The great conqueror who had bent nations to his will now lay silent in stone, reduced to frailty, yet radiating a presence so overwhelming that the archivist nearly dropped the lamp. He staggered backward, whispering, "It's him! My God, it's truly him." The chamber seemed to pulse with the revelation. Shadows leapt against the walls, making the carved scenes of battles appear alive, as if the armies themselves stirred in approval or warning. With shaking fingers, the archivist held the parchment beside the sarcophagus. Its words, "Where the sun meets the river and the sands swallow the stars," no longer felt like riddle but prophecy fulfilled. He had solved it. He had followed the path no one else dared to believe in. Yet, as he leaned closer, he noticed something more. Alongside the body, carved into the interior of the sarcophagus, were lines of Greek text. He angled the lamp, reading aloud in a hushed, reverent voice. "Here lies Alexandros, not as God, but as man. Let those who seek immortality remember, the sands consume kings, the stars outlast empires." The archivist's breath caught. These words, so simple, so stark, rewrote everything. Alexander, the man who had claimed divine blood, who had demanded worship as a son of Zeus, had been buried under an epitaph that stripped him of godhood. History's greatest conqueror had been laid to rest with a message of humility. The archivist sank to his knees, overcome by the irony. For centuries, scholars, rulers, and adventurers had sought Alexander's tomb as a monument to divine power, a shrine of glory. Yet here, in the silence of the desert, Alexander had been reduced to mortal truth. A laugh, half-sob, escaped his lips. The professors who mocked him, the father who dismissed him, they all pursued grandeur, prestige, recognition. But the parchment, the tomb, the epitaph itself, they had chosen him, the invisible man, because he alone could hear their true lesson. His internal voice whispered fiercely, "It was never about glory. It was about truth. And you forgotten, mocked, overlooked, you were the one meant to carry it." He touched the sarcophagus gently, his fingertips brushing against the cold stone. In that moment, he felt a kinship with the man inside. Alexander had conquered worlds, yet was humbled by death. The archivist had been conquered by life's humiliations, yet was exalted by discovery. Together, they formed a mirror of humility and strength. But another thought crept in, darker. What would happen if he revealed this? Would the world respect the discovery, or would they strip it from him, mock him again, and lock it behind glass in a museum, his name erased from the story? The professors would claim the glory, governments would fight for ownership, and he would vanish once more into the margins of history. The archivist's hands shook as he pulled the parchment close. He had dreamed of silencing his critics, of proving them wrong. Now the chance lay at his feet. Yet for the first time, he questioned whether the world deserved this truth. He whispered to the silent body, "They'll never understand you as I do. They'll never listen." The chamber seemed to shiver in agreement, the flame of his lamp bending as if to warn him. His discovery was a gift and a curse. Still, he knew what he must do. He would leave proof undeniable, enough to shatter doubt, but he would also guard the secret, so that Alexander's final lesson, mortality, humility, the futility of conquest, would not be twisted by arrogance again. The archivist stood, breathing deep of the heavy air. His journey had led him to the truth no empire could claim. Alexander was a man, not a god. And in that truth, the archivist found his own strength. Weeks later, the desert lay behind him, yet its silence still clung to his soul. The archivist returned not as the invisible man who once shuffled through dusty halls, but as the keeper of a secret larger than himself. He had left the chamber with only fragments, sketches of the inscriptions, hurried notes, and the parchment that had guided him. The sarcophagus itself he had sealed again, burying the entrance beneath sand, as if tucking a sacred truth back into the arms of eternity. The world, however, was not silent. Word of his absence from the library had already spread. Colleagues muttered that he had gone mad, abandoned his duties, perhaps even fled into ruin. When he reappeared, gaunt, sunburned, and carrying little more than a satchel filled with cryptic drawings. The laughter was waiting for him. Chasing phantoms again? Dr. Martel sneered, his voice dripping with the same disdain as before. What did you find? Desert mirages, or perhaps an old camel bone you'll call Alexander's. The archivist met his gaze with calm he had never known before. He placed the parchment and his notes on the table, unrolling them with steady hands. The sketches of the chamber's walls, the columns, the inscriptions, all were there, painstakingly detailed. Martel's laughter faltered. The other professors leaned in, their faces tightening as they recognized the authenticity of the Greek phrases. This is impossible," one whispered. "No one has seen these texts before." Martel's hands shook as he read aloud the epitaph. "Here lies Alexandros, not as god, but as man." His voice cracked at the final word. The room fell into silence, the same crushing silence the archivist had felt underground. For the first time, the great scholars had no words. The archivist turned away, tucking the parchment back into his satchel. Their belief or disbelief no longer mattered. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, touched the sarcophagus with his own hands. He carried not just evidence, but experience, and no ridicule could strip that from him. In the weeks that followed, whispers spread beyond the library. Journalists, explorers, and governments clamored for details. Some demanded that he reveal the tomb's location. Museums sent letters offering wealth and recognition. But the archivist remained unmoved. At night, in the quiet of his small apartment, he would unfold the parchment and whisper to himself the epitaph's words. They had become his anchor, his lesson. Alexander's tomb was not a prize to be paraded before the world. It was a mirror, reflecting the arrogance that destroys men and the humility that redeems them. One evening, he stood at his window, the city lights flickering below. He imagined the desert stars above Siwa, the silence that wrapped the chamber, the immortal presence of a man humbled by mortality. For the first time in his life, the archivist felt peace. He understood now. His journey had never been about proving himself to the scholars or winning their applause. It was about listening to what history whispered through forgotten parchment, about hearing the truth that the loud and arrogant were too deaf to perceive. The archivist smiled faintly. The world might never know the exact place where Alexander lay, and that was as it should be. The conqueror's final lesson was not conquest, but humility, and the archivist had become its messenger. As he turned away from the window, his steps were lighter than they had ever been. He no longer walked in silence as a shadow. He walked with the knowledge that history had chosen him, not to conquer, but to remember. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.